Distortion has a pretty bad name. It's associated with spin, misrepresentation, and fake news, or more accurately, the accusation of fake news. But not all distortion is a cause for concern. In fact, the practice of distorting something might be incredibly useful, a powerful way of changing the way we look at the world, and with it, a means of creating new opportunities for thinking, for representation, and maybe even for inclusion. I'm going to try and explain what I mean by that through another word with an almost equally loaded reputation, queer, and in particular, the use of that word as a verb in the sense of queering something. What might that mean? To explain, I'm going to start with a little history. So the word queer in English seems to have several different origin stories or influences. One important root, though, is a German word, queer, that's been translated at different moments as meaning oblique, at odds with, or simply across. In English, the word queer has a more expansive set of associations, though, meaning strange or peculiar or out of sorts. And it's a term that's been used historically to refer to things like counterfeit or forged coins and banknotes. And we have that slightly archaic phrase, queering the pitch, which means to spoil a game or to put something out of order. And then, of course, we have the use of the word queer to refer to people. First, to describe eccentricity or questionable character, and then more directly as a term of abuse and harassment, most often as a derogatory way of referring to non-heterosexual people, or simply to people whose gender or sexual identity and its presentation doesn't match up with someone else's standards for normal. And then more recently again, we have the use of queer as a kind of affirmation, a reversal and reappropriation of that insult, a way of describing yourself with pride. And along with that is a field of queer studies and queer activism, a way of exploring and challenging traditional ideas of sexuality and gender with the hope of extending the range of lives which are livable. Now, it's important here to remember that words tend to retain the ghosts or shadows of their earlier uses. So though I might use the word queer critically and affirmatively, in this context, it's still a word that can be used to harass or intimidate, especially perhaps if it's shouted at you across the street or late at night when you think you're leaving a space that was safe. Once, someone said the word queer to me, at me, up close to my face as I passed them on the street. I just left a shop and I was holding milk. And it remains unclear what he saw, if the milk or the way I was holding it or myself seemed especially strange or out of place or flamboyant, though it doesn't really matter. I know the person was trying to make me feel uncomfortable and defensive. I've told that story before in classrooms and other spaces while thinking about the politics of visibility and how or what gets recognized as different and on what terms. One of the ways I've retold that story is by deliberately misunderstanding or distorting that event. Perhaps it was an offer rather than a claim. I say, queer, question mark? To which one might reply, yes, please, I'll take two. Or no, I think I have enough right now. Or perhaps I say, it was a really clumsy flirtation. Queer, question mark? Yes, me too, and now we can hold hands. But there's one other sense of queer that I want to keep in mind here. An obsolete definition, but one that might help us understand how queering as a willful act can be productive. And this is the use of queer as influenced or borrowed from French and Latin, where to queer means to inquire or to question. And that's what brings me to my understanding of queering as a deliberate act of distortion that is a way of reading against the grain of meaning in a given situation in a way that might produce new knowledge, and with that, new ways of being in the world. What I'm describing here is a practice of spinning a given representation to reveal its assumptions or to force it to signify differently, more expansively. In its simplest form, this has involved artists taking well-known works and rewriting their terms. So we can look, for example, at a number of different directors and filmmakers and other artists who've sought to queer Shakespeare by changing the gender identities of particular characters in a manner that reframes or challenges a conventional or at least assumed understanding of the narratives and relationships in Shakespeare's canon. We might also look to the long-running and amazing work of a company like Split Britches, founded in the 1980s by Lois Weaver, Peggy Shaw, and Deb Margolin. Now, one of their most well-known works is called Belle Reprieve, made with legendary queer collective Blue Lips. This is a show which reinvents Tennessee Williams' play Streetcar Named Desire, and does so in part by showing us how the conventions of gender and sexuality are baked into, composed, and put to work in that original play and in its perhaps more famous later film adaptations. The character list printed at the start of the published version of Belle Reprieve tells us how that's going to work. Stanley, played by Peggy Shaw, is described as a butch lesbian, and Stella, played by Lois Weaver, is a woman disguised as a woman. Now, sometimes queering can also involve taking seriously what is already there in the text of a story and making it a more active, concrete, and consequential part of the way in which that story is told. I'm thinking here of Joan, a retelling of the story of Joan of Arc, written by Leo Skilbeck and performed by the drag king champion Lucy Jane Parkinson. At the start of that show, passing as a man is a kind of survival strategy for someone who doesn't fit into the binary categories of male and female gender. But as the play develops, it becomes a way of claiming and insisting a place and space in the world that otherwise wouldn't exist. Now, no spoilers here, but the story of Joan doesn't end well for Joan of Arc. But even so, I think these two works I just mentioned and others like them are laced with pleasure, with laughter, and even joy in the act of making room for yourself and others like you in the audience in a story that had previously left you out. The kind of cultural practice I'm talking about here has often focused on gender and sexuality, but it has a more expansive horizon. Drawing on the work of disabilities and queer theorist Robert McCruer, performance scholar Carrie Sandel suggests that we might approach the term crip in a similar manner to how we understand queer. That is, as an insult that might be reappropriated and turned on its head and used in a different way. Sandel suggests that cripping might be an artistic and political practice which spins mainstream representations to reveal their able-bodied assumptions and the exclusionary effects which follow on from them. For a sense of that approach, we can look at the award-winning musical My Left Right Foot by theatre maker and performance artist Robert Softley, the award-winning artistic director of Birds of Paradise Theatre Company based here in Glasgow. Now, this is a wickedly funny show which imagines a local amateur dramatic society under pressure to comply with the equalities agenda. And so they decide to create a show based on the Oscar-winning film My Left Foot, even though the company doesn't have any disabled performers. Softley has pointed out that the reception of the original film focused on Daniel Day-Lewis's performance as a non-disabled actor, rather than on the story of Christy Brown as a person with cerebral palsy on whose life the work is based. Cutting against this dynamic and that erasure, My Left Right Foot is a musical which takes the original film as the inspiration and raw material for a show which confronts an audience with the comic and ugly spectacle of an able-bodied performer cripping up. But it's also a work which queers the original film and calls attention to the standards of an industry that still often finds it difficult to hire and cast disabled performers. What I'm getting at here is how queering and cripping might have in common an attempt to expose the normative standards which shape our lives and the social ramifications which follow on from attempts to homogenize the incredible diversity of what counts as fully human. One thing to keep in mind here is that our sense of something being distorted might still depend on our understanding of an original form. By this I mean we might perceive something to be distorted only insofar as we have a mental image of something's original correct form. The term distortion as applied to a queer person or a person with disabilities might be an insult. And when I tell you my milk story, you might want to pay really close attention to how someone like me resembles a whole series of things that are commonly assumed to be normal. And yet I can still be singled out. But to be really clear, when I invoke my life experience, let's not kid ourselves. I enjoy many, if not most, of the unearned privileges that go along with looking and sounding like, well, like this. For other people, for gender non-conforming people, for trans folk, and for queers of colour, a practice of queering may be an urgent survival tactic. In the work of performance scholar Jose Esteban Muñoz, queerness is something that's always on the horizon. It's a space of future possibility that's needed because the present can be so toxic, so insolvent, so dangerous for those excluded from the experience of majoritarian belonging and protection. A large part of the possible value of querying then is how our attention is being drawn to the operation of normative judgments and the implicit, if not arbitrary, standards on which they apply and the uneven consequences of those judgments. But querying is more than a critique. It's generative, it's creative, and even messy. And this 10-minute talk is far too neat and fair to do it justice. So I'll leave by saying it's in that messiness that there's value. And it's in that messiness, it's in that shaking up of meaning and that distortion of meaning that allows for new opportunities for understanding the world and for being in the world.